You ever walk into a room thinking it's just gonna be another Tuesday and end up smack in the middle of a powder keg with a lit match in your hand? That's exactly what happened the day Elijah Harris stepped into Courtroom 3B, just trying to get hot water and a functioning toilet in his busted-up apartment. He didn't expect justice, but he sure as hell didn't expect disrespect either. Elijah was 29, sharp as hell, and profoundly deaf since birth. A dude who didn't need pity. He needed a fix. His landlord had been ghosting him for weeks about repairs. So Elijah did what grown folks do, filed a claim. Thought it'd be a simple hearing. What he didn't know? That the presiding judge, Morton Lively, had the patience of a broken Wi-Fi router and the empathy of a parking ticket. Now Lively had this air about him, like every case was a personal inconvenience. He didn't hide his contempt, especially when things didn't move fast enough. The court interpreter was doing her best, hands flying, face focused. But Lively? He was already tapping his pen like he had somewhere more important to be. "You people always find ways to waste the court's time," he muttered, without even glancing Elijah's way. Pause. Did he just say, "you people"? The whole room tensed up. You could feel it, tight as a drum. The air got thicker. Elijah stayed calm, his fingers moving deliberately as he signed a question, wanting clarification. But Lively didn't even give him a shot. "This is a courtroom, not a stage show," the judge snapped, waving Elijah off like he was some annoying street performer. A few folks in the gallery chuckled, not because it was funny, but because awkward silence is heavier than a lie. Elijah didn't flinch. He signed something else, smooth, steady, and dead in the judge's direction. The interpreter blinked, froze even, like her brain needed a reboot. Lively squinted. "Well, what did he say?" The interpreter hesitated, then whispered, "He said, you don't deserve that robe." "Oh, damn." Silence dropped like a guillotine. No one breathed. No one blinked. Even the court reporter's fingers paused, mid-stroke. You could practically hear the ceiling lights humming. The judge's jaw clenched. His face turned the kind of red you only see on cartoon villains or folks who realize too late they picked the wrong person to mess with. Because see, what he hadn't clocked yet was that this wasn't just about a tenant dispute anymore. This was about what happens when power meets dignity and flinches. And baby, this courtroom, it was about to learn that silence doesn't mean submission. Because sometimes, the quiet ones, they bring the loudest reckoning. Right after Elijah hit him with the sign that shattered the room, "You don't deserve that robe," everything got real quiet. But it wasn't the kind of silence that lets things settle. Nah, it was the kind that builds like the sky before a storm. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, sensing the mood tilt. And in the back row, a woman in a navy pantsuit with eyes like scalpels lifted her phone. Former assistant district attorney, now semi-retired but never unarmed. She hit record without hesitation, because even when the law sleeps, some people watch. Then Rima Cho stood up. And trust, this girl was nobody's intern. She was young, yeah, but sharp enough to draw blood with her words. Legal aid, straight out of Columbia and already a quiet legend in the housing rights circuit. She had that "I'm gonna ruin your week, but politely" energy. The second Lively snorted at Elijah, Rima was up like a rocket. "Your Honor, I am formally requesting your recusal on grounds of demonstrated bias against individuals with disabilities," she said, voice steady but firm. Lively scoffed, straight up laughed, like she'd asked him to swap robes with the janitor. "Bias? Because I'm trying to run an efficient courtroom?" Rima didn't blink. "No, Your Honor, because you equated a man's legal right to communication with a waste of time. And that is textbook discrimination." Boom. Shot fired. And oh, she wasn't done. She stepped forward, paperwork already in hand, slid the motion across to the clerk like a blackjack card. "I'm submitting a motion to enter your remarks into the record." Lively shook his head, waving her off. Motion denied. But what Lively didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the game had already left the building. Courtroom cameras, required by state transparency laws, had captured the whole thing. And that video? It had already made it to the courthouse Wi-Fi, through a paralegal's TikTok, and was flying across the internet with captions like, "This judge really said that to a deaf man?" And #Rimacho is that girl. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, a small crowd had started gathering. Lawyers, interns, even a janitor on break watching the clip on his phone. The echo chamber was cracking, and Judge Lively was still inside it, thinking he ran the place. But here's the kicker, the real twist no one saw coming. Elijah Harris, the man Lively treated like an inconvenience. He wasn't just a dude tired of cold showers and broken locks. He used to be a policy analyst. Yeah, like Washington-level policy. The kind of guy who didn't just read the ADA, he helped write part of it. Specifically, the enforcement guidelines for court accessibility. He knew the law better than most judges, including, unfortunately for Lively, this one. So while Rima was handling the present, Elijah was quietly loading the chamber for what came next. He was calm, controlled, but his fingers moved like someone who knew how to take down a system one statute at a time. The cracks in Lively's gavel, they weren't from pressure, they were from rot. And baby, that wood was starting to splinter. By the time the lunch recess hit, someone had already emailed the video to the State Judicial Review Board. And someone else? They'd emailed it to BuzzFeed News. The internet had seen enough. The question now wasn't if the judge would fall, it was how hard. By the time the next court session rolled around, Courtroom 3B didn't just feel different, it was different. The air had weight. The gallery, once half empty and sleepy, was now standing room only, packed to the brim with members of the deaf community, allies and legal observers. Some wore black in silent protest. Some held handmade signs with words like, "My language, my right," and "ADA is not optional." But the loudest protest was the silence. Thick, deliberate, loud as hell. Judge Lively walked in like he still owned the place. But the swagger hit different now. He could feel it, the eyes, the cameras, the pressure. For the first time in a long career built on power moves and intimidation, he looked small, sweaty, like the walls weren't just closing in. They were watching. Elijah sat tall, confident, no apology in his posture. This time, when the clerk called him up, he didn't hesitate. Before he even reached the stand, he turned to the bench and signed to the court. "I request the use of a certified legal interpreter." Not just any interpreter. One who had worked directly on ADA compliance cases. Someone who wouldn't just translate words, but law. It was a chess move, and everybody in that courtroom knew it. Lively leaned in, nostrils flaring. "Mr. Harris, the court already has an assigned interpreter," but before he could finish, Rima was already on her feet like a damn rocket launch. "Your Honor, pursuant to ADA Title II, Section 35.160, Mr. Harris is within his rights to request an auxiliary aid or service most effective for communication in legal proceedings." Lively blinked. The court stenographer's hands paused, mid-keystroke. He looked around like a man searching for backup. There was none. And out there? The public. They were already watching. Twitter was in flames. Instagram had swipeable slides explaining court accessibility law. Even TikTok had a whole trend. People signing, "Not a favor, a right." So the judge did something rare. He backed down. The motion was approved. And then Elijah stood, walked to the witness box, and rewrote the damn game. The new interpreter stepped up, tall, sharp, laser-focused, and gave a nod. The courtroom hushed. Elijah inhaled once. No dramatics, no extra gestures. And then he signed. Not just casually, not emotionally, legally. His hands moved like poetry, written by a law textbook. Every phrase was deliberate. Every sign the exact equivalent of a statute citation, a civil rights clause, a demand wrapped in constitutional fire. The room was silent, not out of confusion, but out of reverence. And when the interpreter spoke, her voice was like thunder wrapped in silk. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm demanding equity. When you ignore my language, you ignore the law. And today I speak not just for myself, but for every disabled person silenced by people in power who think communication is a courtesy, not a right." You could have heard a pin drop. Lively sat frozen. Even the bailiff looked away like he didn't want to be associated with this courtroom mess anymore. Rima didn't move, but her smile was the kind that said, "Checkmate, sir." In that moment, the courtroom wasn't a stage, and Elijah wasn't a performer. He was a living, breathing embodiment of every piece of policy ever written to protect people like him, and every failure of the system to uphold it. And here's the wild part. It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolution is when someone tells the truth so clearly, it can't be ignored. The interpreter turned to the judge, still waiting. Lively, red-faced and silent, finally muttered, "Let the record reflect the witness has been heard." But everyone in that courtroom knew better. He hadn't just been heard, he'd been felt. It started as a ripple, a courtroom moment caught on tape, a quiet man with steady hands and fire in his language. But within 24 hours, it had become a wave. And by day 3, it was a damn tsunami, flooding inboxes, timelines, and institutional walls built to never budge. The clip of Elijah Harris delivering his signed mic drop in legal ASL tore through the internet like lightning in a dry forest. No captions needed. No fancy edits. Just raw truth. The interpreter's voiceover was clipped into reels, stitched into duets, analyzed by law school TikTokers and activist YouTubers alike. Threads popped up, breaking down the legal codes he referenced. One tweet read, "That's not a statement. That's a legal indictment signed in ASL." Retired judges were tagging the DOJ. Civil rights attorneys started stitching together Lively's case history. And that's when the receipts started rolling in. Turns out, Judge Morton Lively had history. And not the kind you brag about at conferences. Over a decade's worth of cases involving the ADA and disabled plaintiffs. Dismissed, delayed, diminished. Parents suing school boards for access. Veterans asking for courtroom accommodations. Deaf defendants requesting qualified interpreters. All filed under his bench. All met with irritation, with contempt, with shrugs. One law clerk from 5 years ago dropped a whole thread. "I used to sit in on Lively's hearings. He called ADA guidelines a liberal trap, thought reasonable accommodation meant optional suggestion. We all knew. No one stopped him." Yeah, not anymore. By the end of the week, the chief judge of the circuit, an old white man who hadn't answered a press call in 3 years, was sitting on 54 formal complaints, with more trickling in by the hour. Some were from lawyers, some from former defendants. One came from a retired janitor who swore he overheard Lively ranting about faking disabilities for attention. The court was on fire, and there was no PR extinguisher big enough to put it out. Meanwhile, Rima Cho, she was busy breaking necks and filing motions. She filed a federal complaint under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, not just calling out Lively's conduct in Elijah's case, but accusing the entire court system of discrimination by enabling him. The motion demanded the case be pulled from Lively's courtroom and reviewed by an independent appellate panel. In plain English, she said, "Your whole bench is biased. We want a new one." Dis. And it wasn't just legal chess, it was strategic wildfire. Because once a Section 504 motion hits federal radar, the courts don't get to hide behind state-level excuses. Now the feds were watching, hard. Some called it bold, some called it reckless. Rima called it necessary. In a press interview outside the courthouse, mobbed with reporters, activists, and people signing messages of support, Rima didn't mince her words. This isn't about one judge. It's about a system that acts like access is charity, that sees disability not as identity, but as inconvenience. We're not asking for justice anymore. We're taking it. Behind her, Elijah stood silent but unshaken. His presence said everything that needed saying. Across the country, similar cases started bubbling to the surface. Deaf college students denied interpreters, disabled veterans tossed from hearings without accommodations. Ada lawsuits that had been stalled or smothered suddenly had new light. It was like Elijah's hands had touched the first domino, and the whole damn structure started to fall. This wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reckoning. And the question on everyone's lips: how deep does this rot go? By the time Judge Morton Lively got benched, administrative leave pending review, the damage was already done. Not to the movement, not to Elijah, to him. And the man did what every flailing relic of unchecked power seems to do when the heat gets too high. He cried on TV. Yep, suit and tie, soft focus lighting, and enough crocodile tears to drown a preschool. He sat across from a news anchor who'd clearly been told to go easy, wiping his eyes with a tissue like he had been personally victimized by accountability. "I've dedicated my life to the law," he sniffled, voice cracking in all the right places. "And now I'm being attacked for trying to do my job. Wokeness is destroying justice." Whew! Somewhere a bald eagle probably groaned and facepalmed. But here's the thing about public opinion. Once folks see the receipts, they don't go back to pretending. Lively's whole "poor me" act might have worked 10 years ago, before court transcripts were viral content and marginalized voices had platforms louder than primetime news. Not this time. Because while Lively was busy sobbing into cable cameras, Elijah Harris was preparing to step onto a bigger stage than any courtroom. One with flags, seals, suits that mattered. He'd been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on judicial accessibility. And baby, he delivered. The chamber was packed. House members, legal scholars, reporters, deaf activists, disability rights orgs, and a few stuffy old senators who looked like they thought accessibility meant holding the door for someone once. Elijah entered in a charcoal suit, head high. No entourage, no hype, just a laptop, a preloaded screen, and no interpreter. Because this time, the world was going to meet his language on his terms. He walked to the table, adjusted the mic out of the way, and began to sign. And y'all, it wasn't just beautiful, it was surgical. Each movement crisp, each pause deliberate. The screen beside him projected real-time captions, not watered-down summaries, but every word, every nuance, every legal term exactly as he signed it. Courts think access means a ramp at the entrance, or a form in Braille. But access is not architecture. Access is not technology. Access is respect. When my language is treated like an inconvenience, I'm not just being ignored. I'm being erased. And I refuse to be silent. Not because I have a voice, but because I have a right. You could have heard a fly choke. And then, slowly, one person stood, then another and another. The whole room, Democrats, Republicans, interns, aides, everyone, on their feet. It wasn't just an ovation. It was a reckoning. Outside, the story went nuclear. Access. Is respect trended globally? Civil rights orgs launched petitions. Law schools revised accessibility training modules. A coalition of deaf attorneys announced a nationwide initiative to audit courtrooms for ADA compliance. And Judge Lively? His ethics hearing got moved up. Because facts may take a second to get dressed, but when they show up, they come swinging. And just like that, after all the chaos, the courtroom drama, the viral whirlwind, and the exposed rot, the case that started with a busted heater and a dismissive judge came back around, full circle. Except this time, the scales of justice weren't just balanced, they were watching. A new judge now sat at the bench, calm demeanor, fresh eyes, no agenda except the law. And when the ruling came down, it was clean, crisp, and undeniable. Elijah Harris had won. Not just a little win, a full send. The court awarded him compensatory damages for the neglect he'd suffered in his apartment. A formal written apology from his slumlord landlord, which hit the press before the ink dried. And, this was the kicker, an injunction ordering every one of that landlord's properties to be brought up to ADA standards. No loopholes, no delays, just a hard reset for every tenant that man had ever tried to ignore. But truth be told, that wasn't the real victory. The real win was in the hallways of power, in the memos being quietly rewritten, in the way courthouses across the country suddenly hit the brakes and said, maybe we should review our interpreter protocols. Training requirements changed. New judges were now mandated to complete disability sensitivity and ADA compliance education before taking the bench. Some older judges grumbled. Others straight up retired early. But change, it was happening, and it was happening fast. Elijah, meanwhile, wasn't just that guy from the video anymore. He'd become a national consultant for the Department of Justice, helping revise internal accessibility policies and signing, at conferences, legal summits, and even Ivy League panels. His message? Simple. I didn't fight to be seen. I fought so others wouldn't have to. And as for Lively, he dipped before the ethics board could even get their opening statement out. Resigned with a 5-paragraph letter full of half apologies and whole deflections. Claimed he was being targeted by cancel culture. Claimed his intent was never malicious. Claimed wokeness had poisoned the legal system. But as one journalist wrote in a blistering op-ed that got syndicated coast to coast, Judge Lively wasn't targeted. He was just finally heard. And for the first time, the person doing the hearing wasn't speaking at all. That hit. Because the power of Elijah's journey wasn't in how loud it got. It was in how deliberate it was. How intentional every sign, every step, every motion had been. No screaming, no theatrics. Just truth delivered so clean, it carved its way through decades of dismissal. So yeah, in the end, a deaf man walked into a courtroom, just trying to fix his apartment. And he walked out with the whole damn system changed, without saying a word.